really great people and papers. I'm Flores, a professor in the history department here at Stony Brook. Really pleased to be able to chair this panel, Class Affect and Social Haunting Across Global Spaces. With us today are four presenters, and I'm going to introduce them in the order they're sitting here. First, we have Varga from Indiana University, who will be presenting a paper called Post-Fordist Affect and the Populist Carnivale, Notes from the Post-Industrial Midwest. Next, we'll have Valerie Walkerdine from Cardiff University, giving us a presentation entitled Class After De-Industrialisation, Genealogies and Cartographies of Class Affect. Next is Geoff. Geoff Bright is from Manchester Metropolitan University, presenting today a paper called Counter-Feeling Held in Common, Affect, Imagination, and Social Haunting in the UK Coalfields. And finally, Mark James, a community co-investigator at the Arts and Humanities Research Council Connected Communities Project, presenting a paper entitled Song Lines, Creating Living Knowledge Through Social Hunting. So as this is a four-person panel, each person will have 15 minutes. I'll serve as timekeeper. If anyone wants to live tweet this session, you can use the hashtag WCSA18 as your hashtag, and
well, thank you very much. I'm going to do something I haven't done at a conference in 10 years. For those who know me, this is really unusual. So thanks to Working Class Studies, thanks to Stony Brook, thanks to my co-presenters who traveled a long way to be here. Thank you for being here. What I'm going to present today is based on my research that I've been doing for about 6 years in southern Indiana and what I'm calling the Lower Rust Belt on de-industrialization. So like most people studying de-industrialization, I haven't had to adjust all that much, but I've had to account for recent events, mostly the 2016 election. And what everybody wants to know is, why did some of the portion of the working class go for this new populism? I'm proud to say that if you see me present at this conference several times, I was talking about this around 2012. I was talking about it as an unmoored politics. And I gathered a lot of statistical weight on it and a lot of evidence about the breaking of the connection, of the mooring between some of the working class and the Democratic Party, which was not the greatest thing, but it held the center on vicious anti-union and anti-worker legislation. Now that politics has become unmoored, and my project today is what I do is try to come up with a kind of way of thinking about that unmoored politics, and hopefully what I'm going to read today is going to serve as an introduction for the manuscript that I'm preparing from all this research that I've been doing. So like I said, I have the empirical evidence. Now I want to talk a little bit about more cultural issues. So I want to define what I mean by populist carnival and kind of test drive this piece and see what everybody thinks. It's a new piece of writing. And so I'll try to define populist carnival, post-Fordist affect, and talk about this, what remains after America is gone. So, in his insightful and valuable work, Cheese and the Worms, the cosmos of the 16th century Miller, Carlo Ginzburg begins with a brief discussion of the development of cultural history and history from below. Ginzburg cites key works in the recovery of workers' histories, including Mikhail Bakhtin's justly famous work on Rabelais and the concept of Carnivale, and E.P. Thompson's work on Charivari, the mocking processions enacted by the poor to mock both individuals and the existing social order. In both cases, the events marked a symbolic overturning of social hierarchy and expressed the contempt many felt for the controlling legal and cultural authorities of the day. Ginzburg goes on to tell us the tale of Minocchio, the 16th century Miller, from a small village in what is today northern Italy. Ginzburg's Minocchio, a literate man of some standing in this community, is a product of his times in very specific ways. He's literate. He's able to read and write in the vernacular language due to the spread of new humanist forms of education. So he reads. The question is, what does he read? This is what Ginzburg uncovers. So with the advent of the printing press technology, which is a new technology, it's a new media, the printing press technology and the spread of new ideas formulated by the Reformation, Minocchio consumes a variety of texts, some traditional, like the Bible, but many considered subversive, containing new humanist thinking about the world, human beings, and God, including works on alchemy and astronomy. Those are key for Minocchio. From this, he develops contempt for the existing legal and social order worldview and cosmology that challenges that order. Not bad for a humble miller from a small village in northern Italy. But of course, we know all this about Pinocchio because we have the transcripts of his trial, because he's burned at the stake, unsurprisingly, for that time period. So I begin with this brief review of Pinocchio to draw an analogy with our current moment. For Pinocchio, factors well beyond his social control, structure his thinking and his challenge to authority. The new literacy, humanism, the early defense of scientific method, the printing press, and the Reformation all combine to create a cultural environment where the rule of traditional authorities, in this case the church and the nobility, make no real sense and are open to question. When these factors combine with local economic conditions to create a crisis in the economy, Pinocchio responds by rejecting the existing authority. So the question is, what replaces it? And so he holds on to some things and he rejects others. He rejects the prevailing authority and from new forms of media constructs his own populist reality. So I was reminded of Pinocchio by two recent events, the latest school shooting in Texas and the ongoing farce that is our current presidential administration. In the former, the school shooting, Dimitrios Pagortzis, the shooter, sported an array of emblems and symbols on his trench coat. He wore the hammer and sickle, which he said equaled rebellion, and he also wore the Iron Cross for bravery. So he's got the Nazi symbol and the communist symbol on his trench coat. And he wore the rising sun to equal kamikaze tactics and the Knights Templars Baphomet, the symbol of evil. He also expressed an affinity for the electronic music of a French composer whose work has been adopted by right-wing extremists, despite this obscure composer's protestations. So Pagortzis combined these disparate elements drawn from a media environment operating in the wake of the demise of the old order. Similarly, in the latter case of the 2016 election, some 60 million American voters combined disparate symbols and discourse like the billionaire swindler who's going to take care of the working man, while an online army of fanatical supporters adopted cultural markers to the cause in what comes to be known as meme magic. And for those of you who don't know what meme magic is, we can discuss that in discussion, but that is it. That was one of the main memes. This was this Pepe the Frog figure, who was this benign figure who gets redeployed in defense or to promote the Trump campaign. So they deploy this meme magic. So what I'm going to suggest is that each instance, though complicated, represents a form of Carnivale, an overturning of the existing order based firmly within the wrenching changes in the economic, social, and cultural environment, a charivari for our present day. So many of these working class voters participating in charivari were formerly moored to pro-labor electoral coalitions. They are no longer, they are now the unmoored. How do we account for this? So my larger work, as I mentioned, has the numbers, the falling union density, the loss of labor market protections. But what I'm dealing with today are the cultural aspects of this new populism. Before going in further into it, I want to make clear that I do not view working class Trump voters as dupes or anything like that. What I am suggesting is that their support for this new populism is firmly within the tradition of Carnivale. So what I want to sketch today is a very brief and incomplete outline of a larger project. So let's look at Charivari. Oh God, where's my sound? Oh no. Oh well. Yes. They're chanting, no more lies, no more lies. A beautiful Southern Indiana accent. So, this is the GE plant in Bloomington. GE had just announced, this is 2015, they just announced a new round of layoffs after getting more tax breaks. And these were the union workers who walked out and they had this charivari in front of the plant chanting no more lies. And my question about after America is gone is, who were they chanting this to and who did they think was going to give a good goddamn whether GE lied or not? And it becomes a real problem for this form of contentious politics. Is there a public sphere in which shaming a company like General Electric is an effective form of politics and an effective repertoire of contention? What I want to suggest is that the effectual intensities exhibited here, the march, the chanting, the appeal to fairness and economic justice, the accusation of lying, work in concert with other remnants of the perceived glory days of the American working class to inhibit creative responses to new labor conditions and to drive many workers to the appeals to mythology inherent in the new authoritarian populism. So I want to turn now to post-Fordist affect and what I mean by that and what we mean by effectual intensities and working class affect. So Lauren Berlant, in her essay Nearly Utopian and Nearly Normal from 2007, describes affect as, quote, the unqualified, non-conscious intensities that exist under or beyond meaning, end quote. In Berlant's telling, affect and affective registers are deeply tied to forms of production, and each mode of capitalist production engenders its own mode of affect. The contention here, excuse me, is that affects as a set of intensities and registers are the underlying, deeply felt but not acknowledged sets of material objects and relations that structure the emotional attachments and reactions described above. Post-Fordist affects are those remnants of these registers and intensities that congealed during the period from the 1980s to the 2000s, when some semblance of a national economy and culture held over from the period of mythical post-war consensus shape and structure cultural production and political claiming. If we can view the post-Fordist era as one long attempt to preserve that security that remains as the dominant narrative of the Fordist era, no matter what its validity, we can see repertoires of contention, among other phenomena, as remnants, holdovers, whose effectiveness is severely inhibited by the changing nature of both state and capital. Under these conditions, acquired forms of political contention take on the aspect of specters, haunting the present with dreams of a past that never really existed. As Berlant puts it, contemporary instances of struggle become, quote, the scene of a constant bargaining with normalcy in the face of conditions that can barely even support the memory of fantasy. And so that for me sums up this kind of the idea of the Trump vote and the Trump voter, the working class voter. The relative stability of the Fordist period engendered certain effective registers, the linkage of certain emotional conceptions of what was just and fair and what constituted a decent standard of living, with certain practices and representations. For many in the mass production system, collective action in the workplace and informed participation in a vibrant public sphere were the practices enmeshed in the web of daily routines and land and soundscapes, the din of the factory, the canned laughter of the TV sitcom, the whir of the lawnmower and the smell of cut suburban grass, the nightly news, and the picket sign. Taken together, the imagery and material production of the Fordist period constitute what Mulbach and Shoshan, in their American Quarterly Special Edition on Post-Fordist affect, describe as the, quote, affect factory of the post-war era. They point out through Gramsci how the true nature of Fordism was only partially about production, but more generally entailed the organizing of, quote, effective capacities of citizens, their deepest desires, longings, and feelings. So for many American workers during this period, the notion that there was no longer any commitment at either the level of the firm or national political ideologies to any notion of protecting or preserving domestic prosperity for wage workers was outside of the realm of the narrative that drove and sustained post-war regime of bargaining and compromise. For many of these workers, even amid massive job relocation, the basic principles of national strength, fair remuneration for hard work, and commitment to stable communities was the normalcy that sustained them as conditions changed beneath their feet. Thus, as Brian Masumi works out in The Autonomy of Affect, the reception of the evidence that America was gone or never existed was always tempered by an embodied sense that the story of progress had to continue. As Masumi states of the embodied reception of intensities and reactions to negative content and why workers could ignore or transform them, quote, the reason may be that they are associated with expectation, which depends on consciously positioning oneself in a line of narrative continuity, end quote. The narrative continuity here, the story of the working class America entering the realm of prosperity, remains so strong in the post-Fordist era as to solidify in place repertoires of contention more suited to a different regime. So these remnants survive while material conditions are undergoing drastic changes. In other words, American workers are reduced to demanding that their previous conditions of exploitation be restored. Make America great. I mean, that's what these guys are doing. Can we keep these terrible factory jobs that wear on our shoulders, wear out our backs, destroy our fingers, destroy our eyesight, and they're so they're begging to be exploited. What or who can restore these conditions that the workers are begging for? And this is where we start to talk about the Trump effect. So I'm not going to dwell on that, but I'm going to end right here. So While I believe it is important to examine all aspects of working class support for the new populism, I think the attraction to Trump highlights the importance of affectual registers in understanding this process. And I was recently thinking of this rally speech that he gave in Ohio, after having referred to immigrants, to the dangerous immigrants, as animals. And he said, you know that they criticized me for saying animals, and he said it in this really guttural way. And he just kept repeating the word until the crowd started chanting it. And I can't think of anything more effectual and emotional than that to understand why people kind of buy into this. So how does the history of a 30-year assault on workplace rights help create the unmoored politics of the current moment? More importantly, how do populists like Trump tap into the longing of working class voters for a non-existent past and realign political allegiances and coalitions? As the new regime, in sync with new authoritarianisms around the globe, works to construct a post-democratic system based in image, symbol, reality show drama, and contempt for democratic process, the gross inequities of the economic marketplace are made worse by the very people elected to ameliorate the problems, deepening the sense of contempt that many workers experience. Lacking a real solution or effective mobilizations of their own, many turn increasingly to the public spectacle of the new third-way politics, the Carnivale, the Charivari as a viable alternative. Unmoored from older alliances, caught up in the affectual registers of a long-gone narrative arc, too many have embraced the nostalgic longing for a country that never really existed. I will end by asking what new forms, what new alliances, and what new mobilizations can counter this dangerous trend. Thanks. Are you okay. Yeah. Valerie.
Valerie, if you want to get out of the light, feel free to move.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You move over here.
How's that? Can people see? Okay. Move it like that.
Yes.
Pointing out the confusion. Okay. All right. Well, I feel a bit calmer now because I thought I'd just go back to where I was staying for a little while, have a rest, only to find that when I came out, the police had closed the road because there was an accident and I couldn't get back. And I phoned Geoff, who was the only person whose phone number I had, but he says he left his phone in the UK.
I don't think I'll do that.
It's
I'm trying to live under the radar.
Okay, so calm down a bit. Okay, so the paper I'm going to present today is based on something that I was trying to do towards the end of last year that also involved Tim. And this is because a big funding body in the UK called the Liverpool Trust announced that people could put in bids for a centre worth £10 million for new, exciting and innovative ideas. So I had a new, exciting and innovative idea, I thought, about class, how to understand class after de-industrialisation, after Brexit, and in the light of neoliberalism and globalisation. And it did. Oh, it's had everything. It's had theatre and arts and except there was only one problem. You had to, the university could only choose one bid. And they chose police sciences. So yeah, it tells you everything about Cardiff. So I thought, well, I've got to try and do something with this idea that I was starting to develop. So this paper is the first attempt to try to get something together. So I'm really looking forward to comments. Okay, so in the period of industrialisation, what class meant in relation to work was, I think, relatively straightforward in relation to what it means now. But now that heavy industry is being dismantled all over the global north, we're hearing its echoes, especially its effective echoes, in elections and referenda all over this same world. And we're in a period in which, in Britain at least, as Diane Ray argues, 83% of the population, a working population, work in service industries. And therefore, what we might call the effective economy is of growing importance. Okay, so in a world in which the middle class assumed that class was no longer relevant, they were saying this for years and years, and ignored the signs of inequality that they saw, or pathologized poverty. They claimed to be surprised when it bit back, or to not understand it, or to assume that the working class had been taken in by post-truths, or succumbed to the contagion first identified in post-revolutionary French crowds by the royalist Gustave Le Bon. Contagion and the group mind provided ways of understanding, dismissing, and pathologizing the processes through which popular affects, feelings, sentiments, and meanings were shared. Yet clearly, complex embodiments, affects, meanings, feelings stretching across geographical spaces and across time periods to previous moments and generations are hugely important now. So I called this phenomenon affective histories. What are the affective histories of class, I wanted to ask. In my book on De-Industrialisation, I argued that the echoes of the effective practices of industrial communities lived on in the next generation, and that actually there were complex difficulties between one generation and another, because the young men, for example, exhibited characteristics and did kinds of work that the older generation found demeaning, and that created intergenerational tension. And Geoff and Mark will talk about this in relation to social haunting. But we know that globalisation means the constant movement of labour, goods and services across and around the world, as well as the rapid spread of information. So what does this mean for our analysis of class and for an understanding of the effective economies of class? The new jobs that Lisa Mackenzie was talking about yesterday, set over the site of a former coal mine, or I went to a session before lunch that was talking about new service industries where workers in all parts of the world service Facebook, for example, by monitoring. In trying to set this out, I've been trying to think about how to approach it. And I'm looking at the concept of entanglement. I don't know whether people are familiar with the concept of entanglement, but feminist science studies scholar Karen Barad has put forward an account of the entanglement of matter and researcher in science labs that has been widely developed in relation to social and cultural phenomena. I've used this idea in relation to what I called effective entanglement in my own work, in relation to some work I did trying to understand how what different people in a family said in their interviews and at different times formed, when you put it together in a kind of single complicated narrative, a complex and entangled narrative in which geographical spaces and historical time were crossed and crisscrossed, creating a dynamic that meant that the participants were often effectively haunted by something at the very same time as they were interacting in the present. In simple terms, they were effectively in different places at the same time. But the other people in the interaction wouldn't know this. So, for example, in one that I looked at, there's a young woman who has a history of being bullied at school, who has a very difficult relationship with her father, but we hear about his father, who was distant and was interned in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. We hear about his difficulties with his mother and his sister, who he thought were domineering, his desire to get away from women, a mother whose father was killed in an accident, a sister who refuses to wear dresses, and it's a whole, but you don't ever hear this in any single interview. You can only begin to piece it together when you put all the things together. So incidents and dynamics from relations in previous generations enter into the present, and the difficult relations that ensue, both in this example of the father and the daughter, and in intergenerational relations in a former steel community, show that that the complex affects and entanglement of those affects in interactions and relations might be thought about. And this includes, and this is how I want to think about it, class relations across time and across space. I've been thinking for quite a long time about how, in a sense, we try to understand these entangled, affected histories and geographies of class. What would it mean to approach class in this way, both its formation and its present and the possibilities of its future? So the complex affects of class could be studied in their own right. The bodies, the feelings. And this, of course, is different from an analysis of labour in and of itself, or some more traditional approaches to class analysis. And this way of looking at it has long seemed important to me because my understanding of class was formed not in the labour movement, but in growing up in post-war Britain as a working class girl. So this meant that I began to write and think about class. I asked different kinds of questions, and also because I was trained as a psychologist, but always critical of how it was used, this led me to try to think about what class meant to me. And that led, in the 1980s, to one, I always remember this incident. There was a very upper middle class male academic at a Marxist conference who said to me, "Class, you have to know this, class, you? Oh yes, hidden injuries." I've never forgotten that. Well, it isn't simply that, but in the present, where the effective economy is a huge part of the service sector, it deserves, I think, a thorough engagement. So I'm using this idea of effective entanglement to think also of how class is always effectively entangled across time, across generations, across vast global spaces, and in our everyday lives. That we are inside, and that we're inside this all the time. Buying goods and services, reading the internet, work movements, travel, everything flows across time and space at a rapid and indeed instantaneous pace. While it's true that global trade was always important for heavy industry, and indeed workers lived the rise and fall of global commodity prices in their experience of work, it seems not only to have increased in pace, but also in complexity. So genealogy and cartography as useful tools seem important to me, and I've lost all track of time. 2 minutes? Oh shit.
I was trying to get your attention.
You failed to get my attention.
Yeah, I was like 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So I think genealogy and cartography are really useful terms, and we're not going to hear about them. But
We'll take it as a given.
Yeah. So I mean,
Q&A, we can.
yeah. Okay. Well, I'm just going to try and wrap it up in 2 minutes. Okay. So I won't talk about Felix Guattari, which I was going to talk about, but the cartographies of neoliberalism and globalization trace movements and flows of goods, services, labour, discursive flows, the way of regulating and governing, and what I was really trying to begin to do by sketching out both a history that we could understand through a genealogy of class and linked to a cartography of class was to attempt to understand both the temporal, so that a vertical and horizontal axis of what an approach to class this way might mean, and how those flows across the vertical and horizontal axis are always present all of the time, flowing across time and across global spaces, right into, as Felix Guattari argued, into even imaginative spaces in which we then think about and imagine what the world might become. And I'm sure I've had more than the 2 minutes, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. I've just got a little adjustment to make to get my stuff up. Right, okay. Yeah, my name's Geoff, Manchester Metropolitan University. There will be a sequence of images appearing behind the talk. We kind of broadly choreograph into the text that I'm about to read, but they're not illustrative, so don't try and kind of puzzle the connections. It's an attempt actually to kind of effectively perform an aspect of what I'm going to talk about. And they're supposed to be self-timed 30 seconds each, so that should work. Which way do we find this thing?
The forward one.
Right.
Yeah, this one.
So it should.
You turned it off, Geoff.
This one. Yeah.
And again. Right, okay, so it should move on at 30 seconds from here. They're all permitted, I've got permissions for all, and they're my photographs. I want to take the opportunity here to discuss a specific aspect of a now extensive body of work that I've brought together over the last few years. In general, that work focuses on the entanglement of affect and imagination in working class experience and how it's played out at key moments of a 30-year period of Coal's UK de-industrialisation. The 1984-85 UK miners' strike will soon be 35 years past, and the coal industry is now completely gone. Coal has been definitively repositioned from industrialisation's priceless black diamond to the bête noire of the Anthropocene. But the feelings generated by coal's conflicted past endure. The spontaneous Thatcher funerals that celebrated the death of former UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 2013 had their root in those revenant energies, as, I'd argue, did the widespread Brexit vote across the coalfields. Essentially, the projects I've brought together have tried to operationalise Avery Gordon's idea of a social haunting, first elaborated in a remarkable Ghostly Matters Haunting and Sociological Imagination. The UK coalfields, I contest, are in many ways a paradigm case of a social haunting in Gordon's sense. A social haunting, she tells us, is, and I'm largely quoting through this section, is evident in social settings when disturbed feelings cannot be put away. It is an entangling reminder of lingering trouble relating to a social violence done in the past, and a notification that what's been concealed is very much alive and present and showing up without any sign of leaving. Most importantly in Avery's account, a social haunting, while painful, is not pathological. Rather, it's a generative, socio-political, psychological state that alerts us to a situation where, and there's a big underline under this, where something else, something different from before, seems like it must be done. It raises, that is, a political imperative. If my work can claim any lasting originality, it's in developing the space as a ghost lab, that's the ghost lab, as a germinating chamber for collectively reimagining that something different from before that needs to be done. And it's on ghost labs that I specifically want to focus here. I should have said in starting, making a judgment about how much context to leave out of this is very difficult. There's a massive volume of material. There's a website that comprehensively covers that I'll give you the address to later on. Fundamentally, a ghost lab is a participatory process space. It's a semi-improvised, horizontal, community/activist/arts event space in Masumi's terms, which aims to collectively reimagine, quote, what the ghost might want from us, as British sociologist Les Back has posed the question. And the lab's only really defining feature is a commitment to let the ghost speak, come what may. The ghost labs are facilitated, but loosely, and a repertoire of playful arts devices are used to approach affective/imaginary materials that are hidden in plain sight in the life of our partner working class communities. The arts devices employed have commonly included what we've called haunted object work, ghost hunting, cooperative and individual ghostwriting, comic strip production, and most frequently, another invention of ours that felt quite crazy at the time when we first started doing it, community tarot readings. It's pretty much the case that anything can happen in the labs. However, the fundamental working hunch is that whatever does happen will allow atomised feelings and imaginings to be re-articulated out of the blind field of a haunting and into the range of a collective, agentic reimagination in common. With an eye on the new material turn in arts practice and the growth of effective methodologies, there's references all through this section, I'll not dwell on them. The Ghost Lab design finds inspiration in a promiscuous cohabitation of effect theory, dialogic arts practice from Grant Kester, transversal group practice in Guattari, and contemporary rethinkings of post-autonomous notions of workers' inquiry, to quote the strongest influences. Ethnography and auto-ethnography are also basic to the approach, as is a core ethic of each being alongside all in affirmation, celebration, and what Lauren Ballant has called a properly political form of love. So what actually happens in a ghost lab? Well, most commonly we begin with a circle discussion prompted by haunted objects that people have brought along, and things develop from there to talking, writing together as a group, cartooning, or being involved in a reading from the community tarot pack. At one moment, everyone might be riveted to the voice of a single person. At another, they'll be talking wildly over each other as re-inhabited feelings find expressions. Things fly off at a tangent, then meander and repeat for a while. Exchanges are by turn heart-rending. There are frequently tears. stomach churning, and uproariously funny. Jokes are cracked, stories of place, change, conflict, growing and aging, trauma, lightness, love, loss, cherished hobbies, risks taken, joys enjoyed, death are ubiquitous. And the rhythm is one of intensifying and diminishing intensities. Given my limited time, I'd like to share just 3 vignettes selected from the scores of equally vivid examples on which I could draw. One of these is from a lab on the Durham Coalfields, another from the South Yorkshire Coalfield, and the third from the 2016 Festival of Utopia in central London. The first is an account of an underground roof fall 25 years ago at a coal face 6 miles out and 500 metres deep under the North Sea off the East Durham coast. It was given by D, a former coal miner, as part of his response to his haunted object, which was his colliery identity tag. D began by evoking a strange and estranged character of the underground colliery environment by describing our permanent wind, caused by the unidirectional flow of mechanical ventilation, is always present, and depending on your position is either in your face or behind you. It never changes. On the day in question, D was working, quoting from D largely through this section, in a 42 inches deep coal seam with a post stone roof, a very hard stone post stone. And D describes how when the coal was cut and the face retreated, the roof supports were meant to just drop in a predictable way, so they were left unprotected. But, this is D all the way through here, post stone just stands for a very long time, and we kept coming back and still cutting, and coming back leaving the roof unsupported, and it got to about 500 metres still standing behind you where your light couldn't go to where you started from. And we could see this fault coming in the roof like a pencil line on a piece of paper. You're watching it, and it's coming further down the face as you're retreating the coal. And then once it got to the other end, this whole roof, about 550 metres by then, just dropped. And the weight and volume of stone just pushed all the air off the coal face. And it just stopped the wind. Everything just stagnant for a while. And then after a while, you could feel the wind starting to come back. And that terrified the life out of us. The noise of it and the feel of the air. The second vignette is from one of the different ghost labs where T, a mental health activist, was part of a comic strip workshop. T shared his storyboard for a comic strip that he called Boundary Road. Running diagonally across his sheet of paper, Boundary Road intersected one particular urban parliamentary constituency in the city of Sheffield. In this constituency, the Labour Party has long been historically dominant, and the particular locality on which T focused his drawing is, according to him, always approached complacently as if its politics and thereby any local campaigning can always be relied on. T's Boundary Road, a real road with a different name, had been imaginatively renamed, he told us, because it's really a boundary between two divergent, class-based political geographies. One, on one side of the road, around the university and its community of students and academics, another, on the other side of the road, the home to a very diverse and precarious inner-city working-class population. The naming, an open acknowledgement of the separation between these two geographies, T insisted, was vital to understanding unacknowledged subterranean tensions underlying the local politics of the area. Boundary Road, he said, was a kind of fault line. An insight that has since come to pass in a bitter dispute which forms the centre of Mark's presentation, to be delivered shortly, about a Labour council enforcing the removal of trees in the city of Sheffield. The third vignette is from a ghost lab that was offered for a group of East London youth from an autonomous youth centre with whom we were working on the very first day of the 2016 Utopia Festival, the day after the EU referendum and the day on which the narrow Brexit result was declared. The young people in attendance, a diverse and politicised Metropolitan group, were very exercised about the referendum result and talked of being robbed of our future. One young woman drew her community tarot cards. There's a way in which we approach these readings. She drew sleep, she drew summer, and she drew a card showing the untitled image of the petrol service station. She immediately repositioned the cards to make a narrative that expressed her experience and nominated sleep as her present card, saying, I was kind of confused because I thought this represents me now. I'm really tired. Summer, she decided, was actually her past card. But for the past, I've done it as last summer. And sleep, I don't really get any sleep. The petrol station was her future card, like a place you go to stop off and just get a breather sort of thing. And it's sort of like a getaway of having some sleep. From this stimulus, she wrote the following poem, straight off, without any assistance or rewriting. An exhausted way out of the city, pretending to find happiness with only a road away, 2, 3 streets of love a day, but not a sound or sleep could make me happy. Summer light to cause a future, but a dark night to cause a saviour. This is on the day of the Brexit declaration. These vignettes might at first seem slight, though I now think of them rather as compressions. If we set them in a context of a social haunting, however, they speak resonantly. Recently, Valerie Walkerdine has emphasised, Walkerdine has emphasised how effective histories have been told off for that before. Working class communities most commonly make them, the effective histories of working class communities most commonly make themselves present through small anecdotal details in conversations and interviews, and this is a space of community self-determination. It is a space that is of collective political articulation, at least on a small scale. In all 3 of our vignettes, there are commonalities across very different times and contexts. We see powerful and unpredictable forces, fault lines, an anticipatory sense of warning, a feel for agency in materials that are other than human and both organic and inorganic, and an acute sense of the precarity in both Populist sense as well as standing sense of events and their outcomes. And this kind of stuff poured into the space of the Ghost Labs at the slightest stimulus of a cherished object, an urban architecture of social division, a random arrangement of 3 cards. So what is the significance of these fragments of effective histories? First, we're dealing here, I think, with a narrative poetics. It shimmers out of the Ghost Labs as a surprise, an excess. I should have expected this, really, as the firm direction of my own ethnographic work had been increasingly towards forces of effect and imagination, and to anthropologist Kathleen Stewart's post-structuralist ethnographic project that attends to those. Drawing like Avery Gordon on a literature that sees, as we do, a crux point in Raymond Williams' 1977 work on structures of feeling, Stewart calls for an attunement to ordinary effects that come into view, this is a quote from Stewart, as habits of shock, resonance or impact that work not through meanings per se, and repeat that, not through meanings per se, but rather in the way that they pick up density and texture as they move through bodies, dreams, dramas, and social worldings of all kind. Narrative is the most prominent mode through which the forces and intensities of a haunting is socially worlded in the Ghost Labs. Anthropologist Peter Collins has recently addressed the challenge that haunting brings to anthropology and has, as we have, zeroed in on imagination and effect as key. Reminding us that ghostly presence reaches beyond the allegorical and metaphorical, Collins asserts unambiguously that hauntings can only be understood in relation to narrative, and what is more, that the narrative gaps, spaces, lacunae that are characteristic of hauntings are completed or repaired most often by the prompting of ghosts, transformed from the apparitional through the concerted efforts of participants who are familiar with their haunting presence. As a result, a critical aesthetic/politics, I'm thinking increasingly here of a reappraisal of Marcuse, is thus initiated. I'm out of time, so I'll leave the last paragraph off.
Oh, okay, finish
Finish
the last
the
paragraph, yeah.
The Ghost Lab's distinguishing feature, I want to conclude in a very work-in-progress kind of way, is precisely its capacity to enable a classed poetics of forces and intensities, of ordinary effects to flourish and move towards the repair and completion through collective reconfiguration that Collins identifies. Basically, the insight that we've stumbled onto in the labs is that social goals are made material there. In essence, feeling, ruthlessly privatised as a core aspect of capital's neoliberal project, is made available for reimagination in common, and being thus made common once more, is thenceforward held in common as a collective bond, as re-solidarised, if that's the term, creative sociality. This is the crux of what I want to draw attention to. It's essential that this affective / imaginative / aesthetic dimension is recognised as a basic aspect of what Bev Skeggs has called autonomous working class value practices, and therefore also as part of any politics that might constitute neoliberal capitalism's nemesis. The right are acutely aware that the ownership of affect and imagination are critical to any politics of sustained domination and are intensely invested in their ongoing privatisation and consequent easy manipulation of this dimension. As part of the antidote, our experience in the Ghost Labs quietly but emphatically insists that our critical inquiry into contemporary decompositions and recompositions of class gets over social science's sedimented fear of feeling, of imagination, and of things that go bump in the sociological knowledge. And gets over it pretty damn quickly. If we don't, I'm doubtful we'll ever really comprehend phenomena like Trump, the growth of the European right, Brexit, and their king. Thank you.
Everyone's flagging after 45 minutes of that. Just before I get started, I've got sort of two poses. If I look a bit bug-eyed, I was up at 3 this morning finding out what was happening back home, and I'll refer to a court case. There have been prison sentences over what I've been describing, but no one is in jail yet. Okay? So remember that one. I'll make a reference to a court case. No one is in jail yet. And we'll just get the iPad going. So my name is Mark James. I'm a retired geographer, so I've actually got a public sector pension. Anyone from a British university, I've got a defined pension, and I worked in the Sheffield City region for nearly 35 years teaching sociology and geography. I am branch secretary of Unite the Union's community branch in South Yorkshire. For the last 3 years, the Ghost Labs have been exploring the nooks and crannies of de-industrialised northern England. Inspired by Avery Gordon's observation that life is complex, I've certainly listened, observed, and learned a lot, first as a participant, then as an observer. Yet while we were out in the field, right on my own doorstep, a struggle was emerging that sheds a contrasting but sympathetic light on ordinary people's lived experience in post-industrial Brexit Britain. A struggle illustrating Gordon's suggestion that a haunting is a domain of turmoil and trouble. A trouble that still has not gone away because those in power persistently, insistently refuse to listen. I live in the city of Sheffield, Yorkshire. Sheffield is the 4th largest city in England, famed for its still existent steel industry, often referred to as the largest village in the country, because of its hilly topography, breaking up any urban sprawl, and its intensely provincial character, which is a consequence of its geographical isolation, nestled in the foothills of the southern Pennines. Historically, a quarter of all rail freight traffic in the United Kingdom originated in the Sheffield City region. Its industry not only produced a huge amount of pollution, but also a rebellious character that gave the Shadow Chancellor, John MacDonald, license to say, without irony, on a recent visit to the city, that it was the city of resistance in the UK. In the late 19th century, one of the city's great resistors, gay rights activist and pioneer socialist Edward Carpenter, berated the city's leaders about the great thick cloud of smog rising out of Sheffield that was like the smoke from Judgment Day. Now the pollution is from road traffic, with smog trapped in the deeply incised valleys. Still a place that can be described, as John Ruskin wrote, though, as the ugly picture in the beautiful frame. The city leaders 100 years ago must have listened to Carpenter as the subsequent residential development was accompanied by the planting of millions of trees, and I'm not joking, it's millions, to mitigate the pollution. Allied with many hillsides being too steep for a development and protected by philanthropic purchase, the city now has the legacy, and it is true, of the largest urban forest in Europe. We'll just go on to and there is a lovely example outside my house. It is this forest that is under threat from the city's council Streets Ahead programme operated by the Spanish multinational AMI, a private finance initiative worth £2.2 billion, the largest local authority public-private partnership in the United Kingdom. Originally conceived as a way of addressing Sheffield's appalling roads, it has led to AMI, with the Labour-led council support, to seek to fell half of the city's streets or roadside trees, whether healthy or not. As one prominent tree protester put it, there must be something in the contract between AMI and the council that incentivises the felling of healthy trees. So far, some 5,000 trees have been felled with at least the same, by the way, the photos are mine, by the same amount left under threat. Though representing a tiny proportion of the several million trees in the city, much to the council's bewilderment, and indeed of the traditional left, who think their protesters' energies would be best placed elsewhere, the street felling has produced an energetic response. To understand why can only be done by witnessing a felling of a large, mature, healthy tree. The process is violent in the extreme. Chainsaws scream, male arbs strut with their machinery shouting, and it's not nice shouting. Dust fills the air. First, the arbs handsaw some smaller branches from the tree, which are dropped to the ground to produce a basket for the larger branches to fall onto. Then the chainsaws come out to attack the larger branches, which are normally lowered with care onto the basket below, but more often than not are dropped with a resounding thump. Once the stump is left out, the axe comes, which cuts a notch into the tree, which eventually leaves the remnants of the tree that is left to be grinded later, hence Sheffield now being called Stump City. No doubt the arb's work is dangerous, but the effect on the protesters below is stark. There are howls of rage, there is grief. As one campaigner suggested, it is hardly surprising that people are so angry as their quietness has been shattered. Or as Gordon puts it, there is the realisation that things are not quite in their assigned places. In the face of such disturbance, resistance has grown. Local government intransigence, allied with withering propaganda, has produced the increased use of private security, and the deployment of police to crush the protests has only reinforced the protesters' steel. As the atmosphere has become more tense, the cracks and rigging of the world have been exposed to the protesters, where something, as Avery Gordon says, must be done. The protesters have learned that they must confront the forces of the state, much like the miners did a generation before. The deployment of the police in alliance with private security that's actually a very happy picture, don't be fooled, has only prompted the protesters to devise more and more ingenious methods of action. Protesters establish nighttime patrols on threatened streets to watch out for any so-called vampire arbs. They alert each other about felling through social media. Once a protest starts, a bunny might leap over or under the security fencing to hug the tree, thereby preventing a felling for safety reasons. More often than not, these protesters are not the known activists, that are masked, disguised local residents who are so incensed that they are prepared to risk imprisonment with their actions. Another form of direct action is the gecko, who squeezes between, they look quite casual, it got fierce after that, who squeezes between the security fencing and the wall to impede the felling. The gecko risks having their face and body being imprinted with the pattern of the fencing, as zealous security guards try to force them to move. And I haven't got a picture of this. Finally, there is the squirrel, who often at great risk climbs into a tree to prevent a felling. So despite the best attempts of the local Labour or socialist leadership to shut down the protests, resistance has become more and more inventive and intensive. The creativity of the protesters has not stopped at direct action. There has been street poetry and song to entertain the protesters, and indeed the arts, the cops. T-shirts, mugs, scarves and posters have been produced. Concerts have been arranged featuring, well, maybe in Britain, well-known supporters such as Jarvis Cocker of Pulp. The members of STARTS, the so-called Street Tree Arts Sheffield, have been doing watercolours of threatened trees for 6 months. Often they do it in situ at protest. And one day when there was a lot of anguish and violence, one painter said to me that it was her therapy. The group have mounted an exhibition, supported local conservation groups and their artwork, and will be in London in the autumn to talk at a major conference about their art and how it will sustain the struggle by producing joy. I joined STARTS in a wood on the Yorkshire-Derbyshire border, an enchanted place where the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Mercia and Northumbria met, a place where it is difficult to believe that you are less than 10 miles from a major industrial city. As I grappled with the challenge of portraying the scene, I found myself being drawn in, attentive to the textures of the land and the sky, more tuned to the conversations that were being had. The idea of sketching and painting being both therapeutic and restorative became clearer. We discussed the anguish of watching a healthy tree being needlessly felled. I reflected on a neighbour of mine having a migraine after one of several actions on our road to prevent the tree felling. As we recounted these stories, a bonding took place, a community began to be built, solidarity established, solidarity imagined. As one of the START members remarked, where else could you get conversations like this? In the middle of our painting, I haven't got a picture because I only took a wide-angle lens on this one, I was drawn to a buzzard circling overhead. As the raptor soared, we reflected on how rich our day was. Afterwards, I clambered into an old quarry to be shown a gnarly old oak that had wrapped its roots around the sediments. You can just see the millstone grit, the hard rock that spurred the Industrial Revolution in Sheffield, because it could be used to grind flour and then later metal. And of course, underneath the millstone is the coal and shale deposits that stretch across northern England from Blackpool in the west to Lincoln in the east. One of the painters is a member of the local anti-fracking group and reflected upon how a generation on from shutting down the coalfield, they are back again to ravage the countryside and our communities. The hauntings do not go away. As the very centre of the proposed fracking in South Yorkshire is Orgreave, the now non-existent place that was the site of the decisive battle of the Great Miners' Strike. The richness of the day was enhanced when I spoke to a local poet who spent the winter reading poetry and singing carols at the Street Trees protests. She turned out to be the local expert on Edward Carpenter, and she reminded me that Carpenter lived in the village of Millthorpe, just over the border in Derbyshire. By painting and drawing, we were rendering visible those people who were meant to be invisible. We were rendering the trees visible to be noticed, if not by the leaders of the city, at least by us. At a meeting last autumn, one of the leading tree activists argued that it was like a guerrilla action. A war was being fought out in the streets of the city. Linking the trees campaign to the wider fight against austerity, he observed that the tree protesters who were risking criminal records were part of a wider campaign to fight for the National Health Service, the campaign for better housing, or against benefit sanctions. But yet, the Labour left in the city have ignored it. As one tree activist remarked to me about the Labour left, they've no gut instinct, they just read Gramsci. She's really good. She went on to argue that the trees protest drew upon the wellspring of resistance of the miners, the Green and Common women, William Morris's arts and crafts movements, all the way back to Gerald Winstanley and the diggers in the English Revolution. By this spring, the protesters had fought the council to a standstill with the fellings being suspended at Easter. The council posed this as a safeguarding move, but left the protesters with the suspicion that they were trying to calm things down prior to this spring's locals elections. The councillor, the Labour council, were trying to imprison, actually won a local election by increasing her majority from 8 to 1,500 in a small little ward in the inner part of Sheffield. With a bloody nose after the council elections, they called for a compromise in the political settlement. Instead, what they actually did was launched an injunction campaign against 4 of the key activists who have appeared in court over the last 3 days, who have been threatened with jail. 2 of them have been found guilty and have been received prison sentences, but they've been suspended for 2 years. Nonetheless, it leaves the council with very little room to manoeuvre. And I love this one. As one tree activist said to me, "We have got them by the short and curlies." Another one remarked that if anyone is sent down in the court case and there's one case to be left to discuss, it would be the end of the Labour left in this city. Nonetheless, the powers that be want a political settlement. The police commissioner of South Yorkshire said he was seriously hoping, if the tree protests actually come back, that there would be a political settlement. So it is tempting to consider that the trees issue will simply fade away, but I don't think it will. Well-Read Films, one of the branches of the Trees campaign, have actually produced a very well-received short on the Kinder Trespass, which led to the establishment of the first national park in the United Kingdom, the Peak District. The question of access to our streets, our commons, is being reinvented in terms of access to the moors on the eastern side of the city, and also in terms of shutting down the fracking that is going to take place over to the east of the city towards Nottinghamshire. So we have a sense in which we can see that for Avery Gordon, life is very complex, but it's very complex for us as activists and protesters and people who are going to do the research on this. But there is one ghost who is still out there, and that's Edward Carpenter. He's not been laid to rest. Now, for Sheffield, Carpenter is one of the key, well, maybe for England, one of the key great gay rights, socialist, environmental activists. He has not got the freedom of the city. And you might wonder, why is that the case? Well, he wrote extensively about the pollution in the city, but I've left one quote to the end. Carpenter's condemnation of the city leaders 100 years ago are as damning now as they were then. Because he said, then the city leadership made Sheffield the laughing stock of the world. That is not one ghost that they want to hear that phrase again. He's not going to get the freedom of the city while this is going on. Thank you.
Okay, comments and questions for our panelists. Yes.
Hi, this is a comment. This is almost sort of uncanny, but as I was listening to you, Geoff, talking about the ghost labs, I thought about something that related very much to Mark's presentation. When I was at the NEMLA convention and I heard the keynote given by Robert Nixon on environmental martyrdom, one of the environmental martyrdom actions that he talked about, and I don't remember where this was exactly, but was in England where a forest of trees was felled, and there were just stumps there, and a group of women came and breastfed there, to kind of reclaim that place as a place of nurturing again, a place of life again. So they said it's just this kind of uncanny connection for me, but also it's something that I think speaks to the many ways that we can use this notion of the ghost lab.
Here, here.
Yeah, where you go? Okay. This is just a stunning panel. All the papers were so terrific. So thank you. It was really fun. You brought a lot of energy as well as incredible intelligence and creativity at the end of the day. So thank you. It's the best panel I've been to in a long time. I wanted to maybe have all of you say a word about why affect. 20 years ago, we would have been talking about structures of feeling or ideology, right, to explain the various phenomena, perhaps. And I know Lauren Berlant and the field tank and all that stuff has been going on for about 10 or 15 years. The other thing that sort of came to me as I was listening was performance theory. Not only because you guys offered performative presentations of your papers, but thinking about Trump, right, and also about the Ghost Lab as a kind of public performance in a way. And I wondered if that was a dimension, a theoretical dimension that you had considered. And I particularly was thinking about Judith O'Mara's recent book on Detroit and Michael Jackson and De-Industrialisation called Unfinished Business, which offers a kind of reading of Jackson as this kind of mediating figure in a particular figural economy that becomes important to process de-industrialization. That's 2017 is the book. So I guess I'd love to hear a little bit more from each of you about why affect seems to be the category, and then maybe if you've thought at all about performance theory.
Yeah, what I can say is that in the original presentation of this, without that first part, it was at the University of Essex last year when I was over in the UK, and I concluded with 4 video clips of Herr Trump, and they were mostly they weren't about the sound. They were about the sound combined with the movement. And it was one where he does this thing where he's executing someone, and a couple of other ones with the hand gestures, combined with his almost guttural sounds. And for me, that interest in sound is about probably 25 years old at this point, maybe 20 years old at this point. And I've been looking for a way to kind of resurrect a kind of performative study of sound and audiology. Because the reason I originally got into it was when I first started using computers, and that was only 20 years ago. I was a non-traditional college student. I'd never touched one before. And I was really fascinated with the way that the sound of this machine that could basically be silent still had to make these noises that interpolated you into this kind of technological interface with it, and began to think of post-industrial capitalism in the same way, and industrial capitalism in the same way, in that the effectual registers that lie below that kind of conscious encounter with them are often based in those soundscapes that, of course, we don't even notice. And yeah, we would have called it something else probably 20 years ago. But I think that there's a difference with affect, and I think that I think there's a way that things can combine. And I think, of course, there's also new materialism, which means let's make a list. Let's make a list of things. And I do it in this paper, right? I make that list of these kind of effectual registers of the Fordist working class. So I think it just for me, it affords me a little bit more flexibility to combine disparate elements. And I hope it's like an interesting and kind of provocative way as well. So, yeah.
I can't emphasize how shocking a felling of a beautiful tree is. You know, I remember the Earth Firsters who did the Pacific logging and the toothpicks and everything. To come into a major city which is heavily polluted, they enclose your street, send security guards in, you get filmed in your own house, you know, in case you breach the enclosure. So this is our streets, and then the sheer noise is incredible. This is an industrial process. It is violent. And I suppose the reaction is gendered, like blokes, we sort of go, ooh, we will get a bit, you know, I'm having you and all this sort of stuff. But there is crying, there is wailing, and of course, That effect allows elements, and this is my point, allows elements of the instrumentalists left to go, well, they're all a bunch of hippies. Yeah? Middle class white hippies in the nice suburbs and everything, which we're not. But it allows them to go, it's not the real struggle, comrade. So it's how, and you don't think I'm against privatisation and austerity when you see the tree being felled. You think this is a violent rape of my commons. And you start from that process. And it's, as that activist said, it's not about Gramsci, it's about gut instinct.
I don't want to add anything because we just take time from questions, Valerie.
Well, only quickly, yeah. I mean, you know, because I'm quite old, I've been through the whole ideology.
Yeah.
In fact, I was involved in a journal in the 70s called Ideology and Consciousness. So, and the Althusserian, Lacanian, discursive moments. And obviously it would take much longer than we've got now to try and trace that through. But what I think's been important to me in trying to work with embodiment, really, is that it allows, well, as the other two are saying, certain things to be engaged with in a completely different way. And what does it mean to engage with bodies? What does it mean to actually think about an approach which doesn't start with the idea that we're all somehow, well, in that kind of Althusserian sense, incorporated into a set of meanings which define us. Are there meanings, are there ways of being which are other and therefore can be defined in a different way? Those are the sorts of things that make sense to me.
Thanks for the intelligence and perceptiveness of your questions. It's really, really productive.
Yeah, it's a terrific panel. Just like two really quick questions. One, I mean, I think affect theory is so important, but I was just wondering about its limits, right? Going back to Frederick Jameson and like thinking about the mapping of cognitive mapping, right? It's very much against affect because as global capitalism hunts the globe, right, for the most exploitable, cheapest labor, where you're situated in the West, you might not affectively feel that, right? And you need to sort of do this cognitive mapping. So just having that critique of it. But also really quickly, I love this idea of the ghost lab, but how do you keep it capacious enough so that recent waves of immigrants who are not going to be haunted by the same labor past, right? That they can be still part of that kind of working class, especially in America, right? That being haunted becomes like the authenticating mechanism, right? If you're not haunted in the same way, you're not part of it.
Right, great question. If folk do have a look on the website, because there's 4 years work in there, there's massive material to put a long point as short as possible. So in the latest project, the Ghost Labs have led, this is the one called Songlines that Mark's been involved in them all as well. I've been PI on them. We've used song generated from the Ghost Labs through professional folk musicians who've been participants in the Ghost Labs and circulated that with global reach. So they produce songs basically in a North England, Scottish folk ballad tradition because it's pertinent to the localities. And that's been circulated globally through community radio, interactively out along what we call songlines, where there's been responses, community radio responses, and back into the community. So that's the kind of dissemination path, for want of a better way of expressing it. And what that risked is the vernacular quality of whatever has been experienced in, let's say, Northeast Durham, might bump into incomprehension. And we really wanted to see what would happen, and what has happened is that in all the locations which have included Indonesia, Malawi in Africa, Slovakia, Hungary in Europe, and so on, have generated a discussion of haunting issues pertinent to those populations without any significant translation, except by the community radio presenters. So we're intrigued by that, and of course it kind of sparks off, or it comes off tangentially, but nevertheless it's been incredibly rich, and has gone around that circuit now to speak back into the communities, and that's exceeded every possibility that we imagined it would in its completeness and thoroughness. So it seems that the genre does not limit, I guess, what I'd probably want to call the effective excess that is tracked through the creative production process that the musicians had registered. Listen to it, it's all on there, it's great.
What's the website?
The website is, it's on the thing, if you Google Social Haunting, you will get it, socialhaunting.com.
In the back.
Oh, yeah, I was really into all this, even though I don't totally, it's over my head, but it's fascinating.
I think it's still over my head.
Oh, okay. Well, I did.
We're all in there.
Oh, okay. Well, years ago, I was very depressed that I got into the, reading about all the physics, the contemporary physics stuff, and I read about the particle entanglement, and it kind of blew my mind the way it must blow everyone's mind when they read about it or imagine the people that did the experiment. Like I was probably like 100 years ago, or like it was a long time ago at this point. And this idea that things are, that we have this like local connection, but then there's also this connection that we don't understand. It's like it's out in space. It's not connected in any sensible way that we know by like speed of light or something. So there's this connection, and that the implications of that are huge. And it's like it's like science is like catching up with reality. You know what I mean? It's like science is catching up with what what could possibly be out there. So when we talk about ghosts, or when we talk about these things, like I don't know. It's just really interesting thinking about it. I think it's like when we get excited about reality, like what's really real, like like what the potentials of what reality could be, that sort of can pull us away from capitalism, basically. I mean, because it's like these economic systems are just not real. Like they're like just this history that we've constructed that unfortunately has affected reality quite a bit in a negative way. But it's like it's this totally separate construct that. So anyway, it's really interesting, and I'm into it. I have read a bit. I have tried to read a bit. Other. I read this one Buddhism thing, connecting that with the science thing, and also I tried to read Timothy Morton, which was like bad. But anyway, it was basically I'm glad people are thinking of ways to pull this into their philosophy, because everybody should be trying to pull it into their thing, because it's anyway. That's all I have to say.
But going back to the point you were saying about how you read about entanglement in physics, aren't we living in a hugely entangled world where all the time, even down to we're so often, even in a simple way, simultaneously we're looking at our phones or on the internet or on things, and we're in all of these places, or the moments at which something is happening here, but at the same time, that's what was very interesting this morning, listening to the person who was talking about the moderators on Facebook who were in India, and so at the moment we're experiencing that here, that's also happening there. So we're in this hugely globally and temporally entangled world all of the time. Is that what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, and it's sort of like the internet, even though it's based on maybe like classical physics, like it's all things connected in a normal way, but even that thought of the internet must come out of must come out of this realization like 100 years ago that things can be like instantaneously connected. You know what I mean? Like I know that the physical manifestation of the internet was, you know, physicists wanting to have this information immediately, like, you know, when they're, you know, pulling particles together or whatever. And that's why they wanted to do it. But I'm sure that's why they even had the idea to do it, was this, was knowing that you could have these things connected somehow, almost magically in space. So it's like when you know, you have this history of science being against all this like woo-woo stuff, and then it's like science is going to find out all the woo-woo stuff is real. you know, and then it's going to be all caught up, and then that'll be interesting.
So whenever I borrow a phrase or a concept from physics or any of the other hard sciences, I pray that there's no physicists in the room, because I imagine it's like marathon men. They're getting their nerve and their tooth drilled. Like, oh my God, stop! But the one that I really appreciate, because my critical theory tradition says we have to really question the positivist aspects of science and scientific knowledge, and particularly social science knowledge. So I tend to really like spooky action at a distance, which Varga also talks about, which is the movement of something over here affects the movement of something, but we have no freaking idea why it does. And that to me is the social science explanatory. And one more thing, if you get enough of Timothy Morton's books, you can pile them up and put your car up on its hubcaps.
Just before the next question, if I may. I think it's instructive that in all the work that we've done, so these are largely former coal mining communities, and the notions of entanglement and distributed agency, as we might kind of refer to it in our register, mean not the slightest resistance. So that world out there that's often positioned as being some kind of like hard positivist response, it's just not like that at all. Coal mining was organic work. If you didn't have the sense that this just might be going too far, then the roof fell. And that wasn't about measurement, even though mining engineering might have theorized it like that. It was about intuitive responses and capacities for spooky action over distance. And that's the domain in which people lived when their lives were daily in danger, when they were in danger of death constantly. So, you know, it's really instructive to me, the softness of the responses that we got to the notions. People were happy in the domain of talking about hauntings. They weren't troubled by it at all.
I'm picturing the physicists cutting their own throat in the back.
So our official time is up, but please feel free to stay, ask the presenters questions you may still have. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to our panel.